Good evening and a warm welcome to yet another edition at Hyde Park. Tonight in our studios we've invited a senior Sri Lankan American Muslim who will talk to us about social media, technology, startups and all about investment. Good evening and a warm welcome.
Thanks for having me.
We have with us Insaaf Mohideen, a Sri Lankan American, highly successful career of over 25 years spanning across finance, management, consulting, technology and entrepreneurship. He is currently the Chief Investment Officer for one of the largest international sovereign funds managing billion-dollar tech fund, and was the founding president of a healthcare company, namely ProHealth, based in California. I'd like to start off talking a little about you. You moved out of Sri Lanka 30 years ago, and what has your life been since?
So, it's been a pretty interesting ride throughout. I basically went to high school in Dubai. That was before Dubai, it's what it is right now. And then been in California for both undergrad as well as my MBA out there. And since then, I've had the opportunity to work across the various industries, traveled quite a bit, and also been involved in a lot of social give-back programs across Africa, Europe, Asia. So, it's really given me a fairly broad perspective of what goes on in the world from both a financial perspective, socioeconomic perspective.
What brings you to Sri Lanka this time around, especially after the April 21st Easter attacks in Sri Lanka?
I get that question quite a bit. So in the past year and a half, I've really reconnected with Sri Lanka, trying to bring a lot of the entrepreneurial background, experience, startup culture to Sri Lanka. So I've been working with a lot of the business leaders, political leaders leading up to April. In fact, I was here right before the attacks and have been enjoying my time thoroughly in Sri Lanka after quite a bit. But once this incident occurred, it really, I went into, I'd say, mild state of depression for about a week and a half, just trying to figure out, hey, how do we reset the clock back to, the first week of April when everything was just, going as planned. The country was just really thriving. It was an amazing place to be in. And, we collected a ton of funds, and, that's the first thing everyone tries to do in a situation like this, is, how do you get funds, etc. But then I kept thinking a little more, and I'm like, there is divisiveness in the country. There has been, some levels of ethnic disharmony and, even Muslim introspection. And, thinking about it over the next week and a half, talking to a lot of the leaders here, I'm like, what, I got to come down. I got to really assess and see what can be done. So that's what brings me here, is we basically raised a significant amount of money that we wanted to take out to impacted people in the various areas, as well as if we can put it into some youth and unity programs. So we've been here. In fact, yesterday we were in Hetiapola, basically meeting religious leaders across the three faiths, extending some help, talking, really understanding what are some of the underlying causes, because this incident did not occur overnight. These are things that have been brewing. And in wide contrast to the Sri Lanka I grew up in, where we really didn't think along religious lines. Religion is a huge issue. Now it's your Muslim first, Sri Lankan second, Buddhist first, Sri Lankan second. I sense that coming in, compared to when I grew up here.
So do you see that we do not have that wider thought about a Sri Lankan identity for Buddhists, Muslims or Catholics living in the country?
Absolutely. I see that very pronounced, not so much even Colombo, but when you start going outside, you see it massively pronounced. But let's say you take a Sri Lankan population in California, for instance. We all unite as Sri Lankans. There isn't that ethnic or religious divide. But when you come here, you start sensing that. You basically definitely witness it, because when I grew up, I had friends from all faiths. But you take an average Sri Lankan Muslim today, most likely they'll have Muslim friends. Same thing with the other religious groups. So it's kind of like they've drawn back and really built their own microcultures.
You were in the United States during the 9/11 attacks.
Yes, I was.
And you saw how Sri Lanka reacted to the April 21st attacks here in Sri Lanka. Talking about Islamophobia and how the United States managed to prevent issues surrounding this, and when you take a look at Sri Lanka, how do you draw lessons from 9/11, post 9/11 attacks?
So I think 9/11 was probably the biggest, biggest attack that actually got people to start thinking about, Islamic attacks or Islam-related attacks, and so Islamophobia was a huge element, because if you take a look at a place like the U.S., everything from diverse environments like California and New York to you take Middle America, it's highly racist and pretty much a lot of people who don't have the cultural diversity. So there was huge backlash, but one thing that we noticed in the U.S. was, just like in New Zealand, all the parties came together. You did not have the bipartisanship. There was no finger pointing. There was no chaos. There wasn't the corruption. So everyone came to lockstep, and they just focused on, how do we basically secure the airspace, how do we secure the ground space, and how do we basically make sure nothing like this happens in the next month or two to rebuild confidence. And then there was an infrastructure play, and eventually, there was the finger pointing, and it went back to bipartisan politics. But in Sri Lanka, what I, at least outside looking in, we are basically bogged down, paralyzed with chaos, corruption, lack of accountability, and lack of clear leadership. And that's really where I think we're struggling, whether it be Islamophobia or even just handling this entire situation in the country. Is you need clear accountability and clear leadership. Someone saying, hey, this is what the agenda for the country is, rightly or wrongly.
Well, you've invested and advised in 100 plus Silicon Valley startups spanning across fintech, social media, cloud computing, big data and machine learning. When we look at the social media bans that came into effect on and off, social media ban, and then it's lifted, and then something happens and there's a ban again. What's your take on that? Was that necessary?
At a very rudimentary level, I mean, a lot of countries do that. I mean, that's the first knee-jerk reaction, is you ban, block everything because you don't know what's coming in, what's fake news. To control hysteria, I think it is fairly effective, but it's a very short-term fix, right? And then from there, you basically have other measures where the governments can directly get involved with the WhatsApps of the world, Instagrams of the world, and they can institute technology to not only monitor, filter, hate speech, hate groups, anything that's inciting violence, but you can also introduce, I mean, technologically you can introduce a 3-second delay where it allows you to even locally analyze, mine the data before you actually present it.
We can talk more on that after this short break. Do stay with us at Hyde Park. Welcome back. At Hyde Park, we're talking with Insaaf Mohideen, who is well aware of the global tech scene, who is a chief investment officer for one of the largest international sovereign funds in the United States. Well, we were talking about the social media ban here in Sri Lanka. Shortly after the bombings, the spread of inaccurate stories began to flow in social media, and the government, in order to stop the spread of false news reports, Facebook owned WhatsApp and Instagram, YouTube and Snapchat and Viber were all blocked on and off. But we were talking about whether this is ethical or not. And if you talk about censorship, what do you think the government should have done?
I mean, ideally, in a lot of these instances, I mean, in a democratic state, you always measure the advantages of censorship, short-term censorship versus longer-term censorship, right? In this instance, I think it was probably the best move, given that we don't have the technological capabilities to filter and real-time censor data to actually impose a ban for a certain period of time. The fact that it's going on a month later, that's not acceptable. We should have basically negotiated with those carriers. We should have basically instituted the technologies to be able to not only monitor hate speech and any rhetoric that basically goes against the ethos of the country, but also there's technology to be able to post analysis and then basically be able to impose bans on certain channels, etc. So that should be done by now. It's fairly common. It's done in a lot of countries, Argentina, Venezuela, in the Middle Eastern countries, they use certain levels of censorship. So that exists. At the very least, we should have those elements. But now, is it ethical in a free and fair democratic country? I mean, that's very debatable, right? Because at the end of the day, you got to figure out, do you basically, risk the country's security for the sake of freedom at this juncture? I think, given that we're only 3 weeks from the current incident, it's probably fair to have certain levels of censorship, especially focused at hate speech, etc. But then the concern and challenge comes to, now is it going to basically extend to other forms of media like the news channels, etc.?
I'd like to talk specifically on the control of content on social media. How do we go about this? You mentioned about certain countries that already have successful mechanisms in place. What do we do right now? Do we have to have some sort of monitoring mechanism or an authority that looks into this? Or should we hire Facebook or Instagram for this?
So Facebook and Instagram will not do that for you, because, I mean, again, their whole premise is free and fair flow of information, otherwise their business model collapses. But at media technology level, either it be at a ministry level or basically an institutional level, we have to have the ability to define what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, right? Because you can't necessarily block every element of speech that's deemed hate, because that's free and fair dialogue. That's also what promotes communication, as well as that's how you'd probably get a lot of these issues ironed out, when people are able to steam back and forth and come to certain consensual conversations. But once those elements are defined, there's certainly technology available to be able to delay, prevent, and eliminate those conversations. I mean, if you deem that, hey, anything that's racially spurred or inciting violence, and you want those off, it's fairly easy based off of, artificial intelligence, real-time learning technologies, to be able to define what those criteria is in the multiple languages, and be able to eliminate those content without necessarily using draconian measures to, totally filter out or, prevent WhatsApp communication or prevent YouTube channels.
We were talking about lessons learned from 9/11 attacks, post-attacks.
Yeah.
We had to go in for a break, but you mentioned about delaying content being posted by 3 seconds.
Yeah, so that's a technology that exists, but obviously post 9/11 we did not have the issues and challenges that we do in terms of social media. It wasn't as prevalent, and it wasn't the single most used form of communication, right? I mean, we still went to the CNNs of the world to get real-time info. But this has been more prevalent, say, some of the more recent incidents like New Zealand, etc., where you have the ability to go in, and if you basically detect that certain channels are more prone to either inciting violence or inciting hatred, you can introduce a 3-second delay. And what that 3-second delay allows you is then take that information and analyze it through artificial intelligence mechanism, and it's sub-second processing, so it'll be able to tell you which ones to content, which ones not to basically post.
Sri Lanka is a country that is pushing towards engaging youth into startups and innovation. Let's talk about the environment for startups. Is it conducive here in Sri Lanka?
Absolutely. I mean, so going back to how I got engaged coming back here was because we have the infrastructural elements, so be it the IT infrastructure, be it the roads infrastructure, the ability to get in and out easily, the language. English is freely and easily available, and we have a huge talent pool that can be tapped. So it's definitely very conducive to new age startups, because now no longer are we restricted by the visas or whatnot. We are able to basically launch businesses out of here. So absolutely.
What's stopping them?
What's stopping us right now is we're going through that phase of Me Too, right? So you have an Uber, you want to create a Me Too. So we're not letting ourselves think big. So this is something that happened, be it in China, be it in Korea, some of the other parts of the world. So even Europe, for the longest time, like Rocket Ventures, all they would do is, instead of trying to innovate, they're like, hey, these businesses are tried, tested in the US, let's create a Me Too version of it. So I think we are caught in that mindset right now. We have to push beyond that, think bigger, because we can certainly launch the next WhatsApp Ubers of the world right out of here in Sri Lanka.
Do we need a regulatory backing in order to go there?
In a lot of those instances, I think the less regulation you have, less governmental involvement you have, the more innovation you're going to have. In any of these, whether it be in the US, Europe, even in the Middle East now, they basically started incubators, and the advice we've given them is lay off, because you cannot have controlled innovation. You got to let them, everything from the work environment to the hours definition, you just let them go out there and just really innovate.
Let me rephrase this. Do we need policy support?
We absolutely need policy support, whether it be the tax benefits, the ability to basically bring in large sums of investment, repatriate it, and be able to have joint ventures, to be able to promote incubators. Yeah, we do have those struggles. So I remember early last year where I had approached some governmental elements about setting up a alt currency, so bitcoins, etc. As it was picking mainstream, we had a huge play to basically make on that. But again, from a governmental perspective, there isn't the policy set up, there isn't the infrastructure set up to help take on such large innovative platforms and structures.
In terms of infrastructure and that environment, what do we really need if we are to move ahead?
I think we need, just like with the megapolis city that's been suggested, we do need an area that basically is tax-free, basically no hassle investments, and the ability to basically bring in foreign talent and have that infrastructure set up to be able to promote it. And then even locally, we got to promote entrepreneurism as a sexy way of basically moving forward. I still think Sri Lanka basically, that mindset shift has to occur. There's a very small mindset that thinks that, hey, taking that path unknown's cool, but still working for the multinational seems to be the cool thing to do.
Let's talk about youth unity and engagement in Sri Lanka. I think that's something you're very passionate about talking about.
So, if you look at all of the woes internationally, whether it be Sri Lanka, it's basically, even yesterday when I was in Hettiapolo, the head priest at the consulate, he basically told me, a lot of these problems that we are having is between the ages of 16 and 35. You don't necessarily see people above 35 engage or below 16 engage. And that's primarily because, in a lot of these societal elements, specifically Sri Lanka, if you look at it, you got two segments. One is the downtrodden who don't have opportunities, and then you got the ultra-rich who really have nothing to do. They've been handed out money, they're driving $500,000 cars, wake up at midday, there's no sense of purpose identity. So that really promotes huge levels of radicalization, huge levels of discontent with society, and they're looking for identity. And then in Sri Lanka in particular, if you look at it, I alluded to this earlier, you do have that ethnic divide across, whether it be across socioeconomic elements or in terms of how they basically promote religious values, etc. But if you can bring youth together under a common banner to either do startups or basically get involved in local initiatives, whether it be, it could be social give back, you're helping the poor, the needy, but we need some forums to promote people to basically get engaged in the social sciences, entertainment industry, apparel, whatnot. Bring them together. So I've reached out to multiple multinationals as well as media outlets. Let's bring together a forum, just like Summit LA or whatnot, that's exciting, that because millennials want it to be exciting, the others, they're not going to engage. So bring something exciting for them, where you basically understanding their pulse. What do they care about? They're very apolitical, right? They don't care about the left or the right. They're just very much about me, myself, and I. So how do you bring them together and get them to care about causes? That's something that's been successfully done in other parts of the world. We can certainly do it, and I think the April 21st incident has clearly highlighted we have a disconnect with our youth, and we do have certain danger to national security, etc., stemming from the youth. And it needs to be addressed.
Why would you say that, stemming from the youth? Because of what?
Because if you look at what transpired, whether it be the 21st incident or the post-21st incident in the Kuranagar areas, it's the youth that's getting involved, right? So when in most of these countries, when youth do get involved, it's not the gainfully employed, the ones that are working in the government sector, or the ones that are basically in the multinationals that's putting the 9 to 5, and then weekends they're doing their stuff. It's the ones that are either unemployed or the ones that have a ton of money who just have all this free time. So And you do have that issue in Sri Lanka. Unemployment's basically in the downtrodden space basically increasing, and you have a ultra-rich class. So this time around, it might be youth from a certain community, but this has highlighted to me, at least as I'm looking through this is very common to what's going on in Egypt, what's going on in Saudi, what goes on in other parts of the world. So we are basically now replicating that problem within our youth, and we have that divisiveness. It's very clear, even yesterday when I was out in the outer areas of Colombo, that divisiveness is very clear among the youth.
Is there any role that education can play? I mean, if you look at a more expanded version of our curricula here in Sri Lanka, do we need something in terms of education?
Common language. I think that's our biggest issue is, even growing up, I studied in the Sinhalese medium for 3 years, and the investment in English in our country is abysmal, right? I mean, there's a very minimal level of English that they teach you, but more so now with the other communities going to the international schools, Sinhalese is lost as a common language. So how do we basically make sure that if it is English that we're all culminating towards, then let's make sure that English is basically taught in the local media to an extent where people are comfortable with the language. Otherwise, the example I was giving someone earlier today is when I studied in Dubai, went to an American school, part Arabic was compulsory. Make Sinhalese compulsory across all the curriculum, because when you have a common language, it brings you together. Right now, you don't have a common language because it's
so English as a linked language.
Absolutely.
Something that interested me earlier on when you were talking about the need for regulation, policy, not regulation, for investments, and you are quite convinced that Sri Lanka has the right environment to attract startups, for youth to engage in startups. Are we looking at any investments from you?
I have been looking at it. So basically, in the past year and a half, I've been wanting to set up an incubator, run into some challenges, as usual, so we're working through it.
Challenges, red tape or?
Red tape mostly, and then the other element that we realize is really to get the youth motivated and bring them, you need to have huge launch events. So we're actually planning towards a launch event later this year. I'm hoping we can still pull it off, just given that it's probably another 2-3 months out. And from that launch event, you launch something like a hackathon to kind of identify what kind of skill sets exist, etc. But there is massive interest in Sri Lanka around all currencies, around the cryptocurrency. So that's an area that we are very interested in trying to figure out, is there an opportunity to set up an exchange? Is there an opportunity to set up an alternate banking mechanism? Because there are a lot of countries impacted by inflation, etc., that are converging towards alternate currencies. Do
you think investor confidence in Sri Lanka has eroded post these events, or has it been something that has been deteriorating over some time?
I think investor confidence in general has deteriorated over the past 2-3 years, starting with the bond scam. Generally, it's, hey, we're there, we're not there. The rupee's basically been depreciating. It's been, just from a ratings perspective, we've taken a beating. But overall, just given that the security situation in the country was fairly stable, you still attracted a lot of investment because there was potential. But post 21st April, we definitely expect to see some repercussions over the next 2 to 3 months. Although so far it's held up pretty well, the rupee's held up pretty well, and no one's made any major announcements of pullback. I think everyone's kind of waiting for over the next 2 to 3 months to see structurally what's going to happen. I mean, are we going to have that chaos addressed? Are we going to have leadership void addressed? And are we going to have meaningful and believable policy changes that will prevent such incidents in, moving forward? Should we wait until such changes are brought about in order for Sri Lanka as an enterprise to show the world that there is, that they could have confidence in coming into Sri Lanka? Absolutely not. What do we do now? I think we move forward. In any of this, the terrorists have won if we basically stop, if we basically change our way of doing things and how we move forward. We continue to move forward and obviously take precautions, but to stall and wait, that would be a disaster. As a Muslim, I'd like you to speak a few words before we wrap up today's edition of Hyde Park. What do we do now? And especially, you've been exposed to the Western world, you've been in Dubai, and you are a Sri Lankan. Yeah. What do we tell our people as Sri Lankans? As Sri Lankans, I think we need to unite as Sri Lankans. I mean, Sri Lankans first before Muslim, Buddhism, Hinduism, right? And in particular, I think there's a huge burden and onus on Muslims at this juncture to introspectively look at our infrastructure and rules and regulations, whether it be the madrasas that exist, whether it be the foreign preachers that are coming in. And ultimately, we have to ask our questions. While the average Muslim did not commit this, what led up to this extremism? What led up to this radical mind change that we've never had in Sri Lanka before? Is it imported? If so, what are the rules and regulations that we need internally, right? Because even after all of this, I have not seen any of the Muslim institutions introspectively look and say, hey, there was a major failure on our part, whether it be in terms of the curriculums at the madrasas, whether it be in terms of letting these foreign-grown preachers come in, or even having some of this hate, because you can't have hate speech unless it's basically it occurs inside a mosque, right? So you do have trustees, you do have institutions that manage these. There needs to be oversight. There needs to be absolute oversight, and I hope that our boards of directors, the Jamiatul Ulama, the Muslim Ministry, basically institute policies where we are monitoring what's being taught to our kids, what's being taught to the masses, because 90% of any religious follower basically takes what they get from their religious institution. They don't necessarily go and read it. So it is very important to make sure that we are controlling and understanding what it is that we are preaching to our masses.
Thank you very much, Insaaf, for your time here at our studios. We had with us Insaaf Mohideen, a Sri Lankan American who has made it big in the United States. Thank you very much for joining us at Hyde Park.